Our first module this morning, and in fact both of our modules this morning, are going to look at work that our students with Queen's Business Consulting have done with community organizations and small businesses. I'm going to invite our first panel, who are going to be talking about the issue of rural transportation and some of the work our students did around that issue in Frontenac County, to come up and take their place at the podium. We've got a number of short presentations, and then we'll have time for discussion with all of the panelists. So our panelists can come forward now. Thank you. And to kick off this module, I'm going to invite Rob Woyzbun to come forward. Rob is the director of Queen's Business Consulting. You have more detailed biographies in your packages, so we'll leave it at that. And Rob's going to share a bit about what Queen's Business Consulting does.
Hello, everyone. I see some friendly faces and people that we've worked with before. Not a surprise. Queen's Business Consulting, or QBC as we call it, has been in business now for over 40 years. We've helped probably 600 to 700 businesses in the Eastern Ontario region. And our job is really quite simple. We like to help companies that have opportunities. They're looking to grow, enter new markets, test the feasibility of concepts. And we really like to help companies that might have some challenges or issues, and that's our sweet spot. We were asked to join the KISS project 3 years ago, and since that time we've worked on projects in both of those buckets. Companies with great vision and ideas of how to grow and expand, and companies that perhaps had some questions and challenges. And you'll be hearing some examples of both of those types of topics from some of our students. I will let them introduce those projects and the work that they've done. But again, to just thank all of you who have contributed to the KISS process and worked with us over the last 3 years. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the panel.
All of our panelists can come on up, that's fine. Our first panelist is going to be Kevin Majkut. Kevin is an MSc student here, and he's developed our knowledge synthesis on rural transportation, which is one of the key issues that was identified as part of as one of the key economic development priorities here in Eastern Ontario. So Kevin's going to talk about some general principles about rural transportation, and then we're going to hear some of the work our students did in that area.
Rural transportation is essential in communities to increase accessibility to essential services, to make personal travel easier, to increase the quality of life for its citizens, and can lead to lower commuting costs and increase intercity travel, and from that foster the development of local economies. Morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Majkut. As Jeff said, I'm an MSc student with Queen's School of Business. I'm also a consultant with Queen's Business Consulting, so that's something I'm doing this semester as well. I guess before developing a rural transportation system, it's important that municipalities look at 3 major issues. They need to understand the challenges that are presently in the economy. They need to understand economic impacts for their specific municipality, and they need to have an understanding of what Ontario's vision is for rural transportation in the future. So some of the major challenges with rural transportation are access to health care. For example, by the year 2031, 25% of the population is expected to be 65 or older. And as we know, as people get older, they need more access to health care. And as people get older, seniors have inabilities to drive, whether it's health problems or vision problems. So it's important to provide another form of transit. And seniors are actually the highest users of public transit systems. Government policy can also be an issue. It's more of an issue for larger urban centers. For rural communities, there's less bureaucracy, so there's a little more leniency. And the financial barriers associated with rural transit, it's a little more expensive because there are less passengers and they're traveling further distances. There's 5 major areas of economic impacts according to the Transportation Research Board in the US and the Victoria Transport Policy Institute in Canada. The first one is employment and business activity, so how rural transportation can affect employment in the area. There's increased mobility. In terms of education, healthcare, schools, There's cost savings impacts from the system because it's cheaper to use public transportation in a lot of cases. There's impacts on expenditure patterns for local communities, and there's growth impacts on the local community, in terms of tourism, and property values can actually increase by having public transportation system located near housing. All of these 5 things can be included in economic impact analysis before an initiative like this is taken on. And as far as Ontario's vision goes, Canada's population is expected to rise from 33 million to 40 million people by the year 2040. So this has kind of inspired the Canadian Urban Transit Association to undertake this nationwide vision. So some of its major objectives include increasing service options for public transportation systems across the board, putting transit at the center of communities, and this can be done through strong government policies, developing a national transit policy, which can lead to funding more readily available for transit authorities. In the US, all transit systems are actually subsidized. In Canada, not all systems are considered vital community services, so they actually don't all get funding. And finally, to maintain a focus on its customers. Now, when developing strategies, it's important that municipalities first look at the types of sustainable public transit that they could use in their particular community, and also evaluation processes and decision-making tools that can be used in the process. Some of the types of rural public transit include bus transit, which is mostly used in urban areas. Charter programs might be a little more practical for rural areas, and the pictures you see here are from Quinte Access Fleet. So small buses like this or a fleet of vans. There's also ride-sharing programs, which are websites online that allow people to connect with each other and set up carpooling. Car sharing is a little bit similar. It's also set up through websites, except people pay a certain fee to have a car for a couple of hours, so they'll go pick it up, have it for a couple hours, bring it back. And just a few examples of public transit in Ontario. There's Quinte Access in Prince Edward County, Deseronto Transit, and of course OC Transpo in Ottawa. They implemented a rural transit system a few years back that's been very successful. So in terms of the strategies for rural transportation, once we understand the type of rural transit we're going to use, transportation evaluation models can actually be used to determine if a project is feasible before that project is implemented. So there are a number of variables that are put into the model, like government costs, vehicle operating costs, average travel speed, and these models are already developed. So you can find them online. I think you can purchase them from some organizations. Next, we have economic evaluation tools. So these can be used to, when looking at the quantifiable impacts, so financial or like travel distances, comparing different options, see which one is the best for your municipality, which one would work best for you. And once the system is actually in place, transit service quality can be evaluated, and that'll allow for continuous improvement of the system. Finally, when developing plans and making decisions, after you determine how you're going to do it, it's important that all stakeholders are involved. So for rural transit systems, or where you're thinking of implementing a rural transit system, usually won't be a transit authority in place, so there's a pretty broad range of stakeholders. So of course the municipal government is included in that, also schools, hospitals, and employers, to name a few. So in conclusion, with an increasingly aging population and a trend for young Canadians to move to large urban centres, rural public transportation in Eastern Ontario is essential. Thank you.
So we're both fourth-year commerce students at Queen's School of Business, and last semester, we both had the pleasure of being consultants at Queen's Business Consulting. And for our project, we worked with Rural Route and Rural Visions from Frontenac County about the issue, obviously, here today, rural transportation. So in terms of what we'll be talking about in our presentation, we'll be doing a short overview of what we discovered during our background research, as well as talking more specifically about our project itself, some of the issues we face, as well as our recommendation for it. So as Kevin previously mentioned, there are several underlying issues that affect rural transportation, and these are some of the reasons why it makes it such a pressing issue. And particularly for Frontenac County, there are 6 different demographic groups that we identify that really need rural transportation. So these are seniors, disabled persons, medical patients, low-income families, as well as individuals, preschool children, as well as youth. So more specifically with our project, we worked with Rural Visions and Rural Routes to define whether they should come together as one entity under Frontenac Transportation Collaborative, and if they were to come together, how will they go about doing that? So some of the challenges we face in looking at these 2 different organizations is first the fact that they service different client segments, as well as they have different pricing strategies. On the flip side, with their driver volunteers, they also had different remuneration strategies, and overall as an organizational structure, their operational processes were also different. However, they had very similar goals and missions, and that's to provide real transportation for everyone who needs it in Frontenac County, and that's why despite their differences, we believe the best recommendation was for them to come together as one entity, and this would give them cost savings in terms of administration, as well as help them better serve their target customers. So first, our recommendation is for them to come together under a volunteer-based transportation model. So as a part of research for this, we also looked at other models such as a bus model in Vanpool, which Kevin talked about. More specifically for volunteer-based transportation model, what this means is that driver volunteers will drive their own cars and pick up clients who need their services at the client's home, drive them to a destination, usually wait for the client, whether it's an appointment or I guess even for a daycare, and then come back and take them back to their homes. So we recommended this model because with the way the population is spread out in Frontenac County, this was the most flexible model that allowed them to be able to service the most clients with their current volunteer base, as well as had the lowest cost. There's no maintenance cost required on behalf of the organization, and there's no capital expenditure that's needed. However, even with this model, there are several challenges that Frontenac Transportation Collaborative has to overcome in order for this to be the most efficient model, which now Nick will talk about.
Thanks, Amy. There we go. So there was really 3 main issues that we sort of picked up on once we determined that volunteer-based transportation was sort of the right model for this county in specific. There was 3 big things that we recognized as additional sort of next level problems that they needed to overcome. The first is sustainable external funding. So as much as we tried, as much as we would love for this to happen, with the pricing of the rides the way that it is, it's really not quite feasible for these programs to provide the level of service that we would like them to provide and also be run on their own. So having, whether it be through government agencies, whether it be through fundraising or donations or what have you, really coming up with a sustainable external funding model is key for the long-term sustainability of a volunteer-based model. The second, of course, is building that volunteer base. Rural areas typically have lower population density, and there's obviously a growing need for transportation services. So finding volunteers who have access to a car that they're willing to drive, who also have the time and the willingness to do it, is critically important. And making sure that that base is set up for growth in the next few years is of course, important. The final piece is accessibility. So with each person driving their own car, there's no guarantee that these cars are accessible to disabled persons or the very seniors. So sometimes the cars that we were looking at and the volunteers that were driving these cars, they were not set up for the right level of accessibility. And so addressing that is sort of the third main issue. So the first major recommendation that Amy and I had for Frontenac Transportation Collaborative was the way that they price their rides. So there's 3 main groups of people who use the service in terms of the way that they were paying for the service. The first is agency. So whether it be the Ontario Disability Services Program or Ontario Works, there was a number of people who were getting rides with the service who were being backed by an agency. The second is out-of-pocket riders, so basically anyone who needed to use the service and was paying for that out of their own pocket. That's the second group. And then the third is a subset of those out-of-pocket riders, which were low-income individuals who weren't able to pay the full going rate of the service. And so there was 2 major recommendations that we came up with for them. The first was to extend a financial means test across the county, which basically means to look at the person using the service, assess their ability to pay for the service, and then if if they qualify based on whichever criteria they would set up, then to offer a reduced rate to those individuals. And the second is to have a unified model across the county. So as Amy mentioned, we're really amalgamating these two services to have one unified service across the county, and so having one consistent pricing model, regardless of which demographic or segment, is really important, because what you pay for the service shouldn't depend on where you live within the county. It should depend on your means to pay. And so that was our first recommendation. The second major recommendation was the volunteer remuneration. So under a volunteer-based model, typically the way it works is that you will reimburse your volunteers at some level for using their cars. So just as a means of recouping the cost of gas and things like that. It's not, obviously, to pay the volunteers sounds a little bit weird, but it's really just to give them money and a little bit of a remuneration for the gas and for the time that they've put in. And the problem here is that there's many different stakeholders, all of which have a different view of how much that should be. So the local health integration network, the client, and the volunteer, as well as the service provider themselves, all have different views on what rates this should be, how this should be done, and all this sort of thing. So what Amy and I did is we kind of took all the possible models and developed what we've termed the hybrid model. So basically, we recognize there's two main segments to every ride. The first is from the driver home to the client home, and then the second piece is from the client home to the destination. And then obviously those segments in reverse on the way back. And so what we proposed is a hybrid model wherein you get paid one rate as a volunteer from your home to the client's home, and then the fuller rate from the client home to the destination. And the reason for that is some of the funding agencies will not reimburse volunteers for that trip from their own house to the client home because it's not part of the client service. However, as a volunteer, especially depending on where you live, you might be traveling 50, 60 kilometers just to get to the client. And so balancing those needs was something that was hugely important, and which both of our service providers were doing differently. And so how we tried to unify that across the county was to create this hybrid model, which was flexible enough to deal with those different types of rides, but also gave volunteers an incentive to stay with us in the program. So those were the two major recommendations. Just to quickly run through some of the other things, we interviewed a number of volunteers who all talked about the need to feel as though they were part of something bigger than themselves, and to feel as though they were part of a community. And so really working with volunteers and building that communication structure was something that we identified as key to keeping them involved in the program. The second is we sort of anticipated a growing need for volunteer transportation in Frontenac County, and as part of that, more volunteers and more capacity and things like that are going to be needed. And so planning for that now so that they're able to address it when it comes up was another thing we looked at. Analyzing data more to make sure that they're constantly understanding what's going on and making sure they can adapt. And finally, a financial planning tool to help them work with external agencies and work with government bodies to figure out how they can get that sustainable external funding, were other things that we looked at in our presentation. And finally, our sort of takeaways from the project is that obviously, financial sustainability is the key to success for these programs. Running a volunteer-based model is not something that's easy. It's incredibly challenging, as I'm sure we'll hear about later. And so we really just wanted to focus on financial sustainability, and it's really important that moving forward, there's more than one body that's trying to do this. You can't have the single service provider and put the onus on them. It really has to be a community effort to make it happen. The second thing is that we think that as infrastructure grows in the rural areas, we're going to see more of an integration of technology, whether it be websites that Kevin talked about or other things. Integrating technology more in order to bring down some of those costs is something we see in the future. And finally, there's no silver bullet. As much as we like to try to think there was no one recommendation that we could give and that could make the problem go away. So those are really the things that we wanted to leave you with. And finally, after working for 4 months with these organizations, I think Amy and I can both truly say that we really think that if we're able to work together and bring the communities that we serve together, this problem is something that we can fix and is something that will hopefully see a lot of improvement in the coming years. So thank you, and look forward to taking any questions about our project.
I want to thank both Nick and Amy. I know how hard they worked on this project. Amy in the fall was asking me for any reports that had come out of our discovery workshops. They were hunting high and low for excellent resources. And I know Nick was on the phone to his grandfather, I think, who's a mayor in a northern Ontario community. They really did excellent work. And they're both actually going on to careers when they graduate in a few weeks with large consulting firms in Toronto. So when you tap into these resources, you're really tapping into world-class talent. And for free through the KISS project or directly with them at a very reasonable cost. I'm going to invite Mr. David Townsend, Executive Director of South Frontenac Community Services, to come forward now. And David's going to talk about some of their organization's experience in working with the students and taking their recommendations. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to Nick and Amy. It was quite a challenge taking two distinct organizations looking to get money from the County of Frontenac, so a bit of a bureaucracy in making three of us not only want to sit and talk, but come out to a successful conclusion. And with their efforts, I think we have. And the presentation I'm showing you is the presentation that Don Amos, my counterpart from Northern Frontenac Community Services, and I gave to the county 2 weeks ago, signifying that we have an agreement and we can make rural transportation work in the Frontenac County. So thank you both for that. So when you're talking all of the background, the community needs, the volunteer needs, and everything else, one of the key things that keeps getting overlooked is the different people. Different organizations, especially in community services, have a lot of the mom and pop silo building. We've always done it this way. This is our community. We know what's best, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was no different from Northern and Southern Frontenac. And we've had two organizations really come together to make this work. The geographic service areas, central and north, there's huge distances in between. At times, we're even going to have a volunteer driving up to 100 kilometers to go pick up a client, to bring them into Kingston for a doctor's appointment or a hospital visit. Or we're picking up 2 or 3 at a time to bring them on a shopping trip because there aren't really any good affordable grocery stores that'll provide great quality out in rural counties. So there's a lot of that. We've brought two organizations together that had very different volunteer transportation focuses. The North focused on children, on Ontario Works, Ontario Disability Support Program. Our agency in the South focused more on seniors, medical appointments, getting people in and out. But the one commonality that we all had is the use of volunteer drivers. So a little bit of the history, and I've got the clicker, I guess, don't I? Never used one of these. I'm kind of like you, technology. Okay, which one? That one? There we go. Okay. So the compensation and client fees differed dramatically, especially when you look at volunteers. There was a desire of the two boards to develop one new model, and the talk started about 18 months ago. We had inputs from our funders. The county wanted us to run volunteer transportation this way. The Southeast Local Health Integration Network wanted us to run transportation this way. Our volunteers wanted it this way in the north. Our volunteers in the south wanted it a different way. So without even getting started, Nick and Amy had a huge challenge of trying to get 4 different groups thinking along the same lines. They started a couple years back with 80/20 info coming out and doing a real model that at least opened the door and got things started. So if there's a benefit to having a second study done, this is it, is we built upon that, used the history, and used it to create an agreement that came forward. Bit of a history in organizations. Mom and pop silos don't like talking to each other. We are now, which is a huge step forward regardless of transportation. So, as of February this year, the two organizations worked through a memorandum of understanding. Our two boards approved draft number 11. It didn't come overnight, it didn't come easily, but both boards have agreed to move forward to it. And the agreement really covers a lot of what Nick and Amy talked about as well. It talks about organizational responsibilities. Who's going to do what? How are we going to communicate with each other? What reports are needed? Agency expectations, invoicing, compensation, funding, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've agreed on for the county, and this is, or in the county, and this is what we presented, is that we would bill, all drives would be billed at the same rates, 48 cents per kilometer. Both agencies could subsidize their own clients. So the people, the children in the north for the daycare don't pay for their rides to get to daycare. Our seniors programs are based upon ability to pay. If a family earns less than $29,000 a year, we'll charge 25 cents a kilometer. So the agency has to have funding somehow to pay for the additional 23 cents for the paid portion of the drive. So those subsidies come from the county, the Southeast LHIN, and each agency. Where we struggled in the South is because we didn't pay from the volunteer home to the client home, we're now paying 20 cents a kilometer for those rides. So there's additional subsidy that we would have to come up with. So the Queen's School of Business, and this is where Nick and Amy talked, this is the real success. They helped us develop a governance structure. They helped develop an operational model, single dispatcher. They helped us work through some volunteer-based retention strategy. How can we keep the volunteers we've got and how can we build it? They created the driver remuneration model and the client pricing model. So they really found a really good middle ground that all four partners could really buy into. Okay. So the funding model as it comes forward, volunteer drivers will be reimbursed consistently. Okay. It's funny, when we put this together, the current federal rate for mileage was 52 cents. As of December 31st, it was 55 cents. With gas going up even further, it's even increasing. So the actual subsidy for volunteer drivers and everything is quite huge that they're putting forward. We put a bit of a rough budget together for presentation to the county. In a nutshell, the expenses to run the system are $278,000 to drive just over 500,000 kilometers each and every year in South, Central, and North Frontenac. With that, with the subsidies, everything else, we asked the county for $86,000. In a previous thing, when we were separate, it was $80,000. Coming together in year one, there's a $6,000 increase. But with the projections for increase in seniors' rides for the North, Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Programs in the South, the county should be reducing their subsidy for this program over the years to come. And that was a key component with it. And so the outcome and goals that we have set and we've presented to the county and we've bought into is the Frontenac Transportation Service, a new name, has support of both boards. It also has the support of the Southeast Local Health Integration Network, and getting the Ministry of Health to buy into something was quite a challenge. We expect to maintain over 90% of our current volunteers. We had our first transportation meeting with the volunteer drivers in the North 10 days ago, and there was a lot of upset because their rate is dropping because they were reimbursed fully from the volunteer home to the client home. We walked through everything that Nick and Amy had helped us through and did not lose a single volunteer driver in the North. So hats off to you for those strategies. We will keep recruiting volunteers. We will operate at a break-even basis with the subsidies that we've got. So we won't ask for something and come back in 6 months and go, oops. Our goal is to meet at least 80% of the rider requests. We'd love to do even more than that, but because it's a volunteer model, if we don't have volunteers available, we might not be able to fulfill all requests. And our promotion piece, because we are used to not having money for advertising and everything else, all we're doing is buying fridge magnets to distribute throughout the county so that everyone has the 1-800 number. And then we will return to the county. So this is what we've presented. This is what the county has accepted. This is what both boards and our volunteer drivers and everyone else has accepted. And it only came about because of the cooperation from the School of Business and these two students right here. So thank you for that. Do I get to sit up here too?
Our last panelist is Dr. Chialin Chen. We're very honored to have Chialin working with us on some of these new projects Yolande mentioned earlier. And the goal of the KISS project is to connect research and the academic world with the real community needs that are going on here in Eastern Ontario. And so Chialin's going to come and talk about some of the research that's happening in the academic world around rural transportation and how it might intersect with some of these issues we've heard about today.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Chialin Chen. I'm associate professor at Queen's School of Business in the area of management science and operation management. And I'm also Kevin's supervisor. Okay, that's one of the reasons why I'm here. Okay, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to give some comments to the project you just heard. And so one of my research and teaching areas is in supply chain management. And in supply chain management, we emphasize the importance for different players to share the information and knowledge in order to maximize the system's performance. And so this means that, well, different companies, okay, they can work together to coordinate their production and service activities in order to create values in a complex supply chain system. And I think the similar concept can be applied to knowledge transfer and sharing between academias and rural communities, especially in the area of transportation planning and management. And so, and this is a model I would like to use to illustrate this concept. You might have heard the terms models a lot during their presentation. And for most transportation problems, and decision makers need to collect or receive information from the real world, and then to make a decision to deal with the real world problem. But sometimes the real world problem can be very complex, very difficult to analyze, and the risk of making the wrong decision can be very high. And this is where I think academic research can come into place. And so again, that's why you heard the term models a lot, because usually what we can do here is to come up with a model. This is more like a virtual world. So we try to come up with a model to represent the real world situation, and then we try to look at some samples of data, and then try to generate or test different solutions. By doing this, the decision maker can experiment their strategies or policies in a smaller scales, okay, which reduce the risk in decision making. And at the same time, we can try to help identify the best course of action for the decision maker. And so I would like to use two studies we did, okay, in the past, okay, to illustrate this concept. And the first project is about inter-hospital patient transfers in Eastern Ontario. And here I have a map of Eastern Ontario and the locations of the major healthcare facilities in this region. And because of resource limitation, so many hospitals, they are only specialized in a certain limited numbers of treatments. And as a result, inter-hospital patient transfer, that means to transfer patients to another hospital where specialized physicians or treatments are available, has become a common practice for healthcare delivery. So in this project, what we did was to first model the problems as, well, this is a terminology we use, it's called the vehicle routing problem. And then we try to develop scientific method to solve the problem to minimize the total transportation time, total wait time, and total transportation distance. Okay, so that's what we did in this particular project. And about a year ago, we did a similar project for Quantity Access, the Dial a Ride program. And again, we developed models, which is a so-called vehicle routing and scheduling models. And then we tried to develop some scientific method to solve the problem and to achieve the objective to minimize the total transportation time, the total wait time, and total transportation distance. Okay, so at the end, I want to just to make a quick summary, quick conclusions about my presentation and also about the projects the student just presented. I think both the academic researchers and the rural communities have a lot to gain from sharing the information, from knowledge transfer and information sharing. And for us, I think we have done a lot because of this great opportunity to analyze the real world problems. And for me and my students, we have all expanded our knowledge and our experience to deal with some real world problems. And also for the rural communities, I think we'll be able to provide and we'll be able to generate some solutions and also some scientific method to help identify the cost-effective solutions for rural transportation planning and management. Okay, and I think that's the great value of information sharing and transfer between the rural community and academia. Okay, so that will conclude my presentation, and thank you very much. Thanks.
I want to thank each of our panelists, and we have a few minutes for questions now, and so we'd be glad to take any questions you may have for our students or our panelists and researchers. Any questions? Maybe if you could introduce yourself too.
My name is Bob Millard. I'm the coordinator of the Business Admin program at Loyalist College. A question, have you extended any of the activities down to the post-secondary level where kids are being involved in the actual activities and or research being conducted? Are high school students being involved at all and engaged in the exciting things you're doing?
I'm not sure if any of our panelists might be able to respond to that, working with high school students, engaging students in research.
Not as I know, so I don't know about other panel members. No.
Yeah.
Probably not yet.
Okay, sorry, Bob, we don't have a better answer than that.
Hi, my name is Roddy Bolivar. I'm a former executive in a senior support service, and we had a drive program. I was wondering if you looked at the costs to the drivers. We used to deal with their own insurance costs and police check costs. Did you look at that as far as the overall program and whether the aggregate of drivers' costs could be shared in any way through group insurance, working with police, that kind of thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick, they're live.
So we did not look at that for our analysis. One of the reasons why we didn't is because for the models that we were looking at in Frontenac County, they were all volunteer-based, and I don't know if it was the same in the situation you mentioned, but having group insurance for your personal car, which you use, for a couple hours a week for this, didn't necessarily seem as applicable than if, let's say, they were employees of South Frontenac's community services. Then I think we would look into that. And I think there were a few vans that were owned by the community services organizations who paid the insurance on those, on those vans. But no, we did not look at aggregate driver costs and how to share them, but perhaps we should have.
David, would you add anything to how you look at user costs or driver costs?
I would concur with Nick with regard to the vehicle costs and everything else. We try to reimburse them. In the agreement, we've set a quarterly review of what we're paying the drivers based upon what the expenses, out-of-pocket expenses are, so the gas prices. So we're going to review it. I hope we can, with the spike in gas pricing, come up with additional funding to help cover it, but no guarantees on that. The other thing most agencies do, both North and South do, is we cover the cost of the CPICs, the police records checks for the volunteers. That's a requirement on behalf of the agency. If they have to pay for a driver's abstract as well, again, because they're volunteering with us, we will cover that cost.
Great, thanks. So another question? Yeah.
Jim Garrett, just interested citizen. When you were doing your research, one of the things you mentioned was means tests, saying whether people have the ability to pay and whatnot. Was there any look looking at whether or not people have the means of finding transportation within their family, to help people look at different ways of getting transportation rather than relying on sort of this outside agency all the time. Because as a volunteer driver, for the Cancer Society as an example, quite often I transport people, and then I sometimes wonder why they haven't used another resource, and that resource in some cases I thought maybe might be the family, and yet they don't seem to do that in many cases. I just wondered if you had looked at that at all.
So specifically in terms of the means test, we didn't look at whether they had any other transportation available. But within our background research, what we found was that many of the families only have a single vehicle. So what happens with those families is that usually the person who is working takes out the car and the rest of the family doesn't have transportation. And one of the main problems we found for that was with rural youth. So for a lot of rural youth, if they wanted to go to any social activities or even places of employment, they weren't able to do so. So I think sometimes that even with families with a car, it wasn't always accessible for other family members.
If I can add sort of my 2 cents worth, one of the other things that we found actually delivering the service is something called family dynamics, especially for seniors. They want to remain in their own home. They want to remain independent. They don't like, sort of daughter or sons coming up and sort of wagging a finger in their face saying, it's time for you to move, it's time for you to get out of here, I'm tired of looking after you, whatever it might be. So there's a fair bit of that within a means testing as well. Do they have the proper support structure? If they do, then we're a plan B. If they don't, and a lot of people in rural counties don't have that affordable plan A in place, and that's where we really try to step up.
Anyone else want to add? Wendy, I think you had a question.
Thank you. Wendy Curtis from Northumberland County. There's a lot of rural issues in transportation in our area too, so I'm very interested in this. Just for clarity though, did the two organizations, if we look at it from a customer perspective, was there expansion of service to customers? I'm not really clear on that. Whether the one organization stayed with their child mandate and so on and the other one with the seniors, and like the seniors in the one area get a greater access and the children in the other area, that kind of thing. I mean, how did the customer benefit? I see the internal organizations and certainly the County of Frontenac seem to have benefited. But how did the customer benefit, and did the organizations evaluate one structure from a governance perspective? Was that evaluated at all?
I'm going to start with the structure part to begin with. Originally, the proposal from 80/20 Info was to create a separate entity with a separate board of directors, separate incorporation, separate everything. Don Amos and I both came on board halfway through this discussion and quickly realized that the only way this was going to make sense for the customer was to have what was formerly known as Rural Routes become the Frontenac Transportation Service, reporting directly to one of the existing structures. So it entailed my agency willing to give up control of transportation for residents in South Frontenac to this new agency that would A, decrease administration costs, B, it should increase skill level because the service has a coordinator and 2 part-time dispatchers whose sole job is transportation, rather than transportation being sort of 15% of one person's job. C, we are covering the cost of the 1-800 number because even in South Frontenac, if you're living in the eastern portion, Inverie, Sunbury, Battersea area, it was a long distance call into Sydenham, which is where our office is. So there's a reduction in cost by incorporating the 1-800 number. As to talking with the clients and everything else, for the vast majority of them that we have talked to, they're going to end up with the same drivers. And their reaction is, as long as I get my ride when I need my ride to where I need my ride to go, you can organize it however you want. They've got their favorite volunteer drivers. They've got their drivers that they refuse to go with. And the new coordinator will have sort of more intimate knowledge on who's able to go with whom or who to avoid putting together. So there was some input, but for the most part, the clients just want the ride.
I guess to add on to that, in our project that we did, we looked at, I would probably say, 6 or 7 different potential governance models that they could have used, whether it's centralizing, whether it's incorporating a separate entity, all those different possibilities. So we looked at probably, 6 or 7 different ones and came to the conclusion of what David just talked about. I think the other thing from the customer perspective, though, is this adds a lot of stability to the program, and so having something that they can count on for the next 5 years as a service that's going to be there, I think is huge, because in previous years it was like each organization was getting funding on a yearly basis from the county, and so there was always this, well, what if we don't get it this year? Then what happens? And so having one amalgamated service provider who's in constant communication with the county and who has better relationships that way, I think from a customer perspective, it just adds a whole new level of stability to the program. And I think maybe in terms of the actual service itself, I would say they're probably getting the similar services as David mentioned, but I think they're getting much more stability, and I think that is something incredibly important.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Kevin, I have a question for you, actually. I know you looked at kind of a bigger perspective. I wonder if you looked at several case studies of different communities, and maybe what were some of the best practices you saw or examples of communities that are doing a good job in rural transportation?
I'm just going to refer to my report here, because I listed a few. I think like for OC Transpo, Ottawa, like I guess what they did was they recognized the need for rural transit first, then they used like some of the models that I suggested in order to, I guess, like implement. I want to say like before they implemented, they kind of designed how they were going to implement it, and then they tested like how it would work, like using software, basically. Came up with the best way to do that. That was more of a large-scale model. They already had a massive transit system in place, so they kind of added onto it. In terms of like a smaller model, I think it was in Nova Scotia, Green Rider, they implemented a van pool service. I think something similar to Quinte Access. So for them, they recognized along one of their major highways, there was a huge need for rural transport for people who had lower incomes and who needed access to their jobs almost on a daily basis. So I think some of the, like in general, some of the best practices are just locating like the need for transport in terms of large employers in your area. You might be in a rural area, but there might be a massive manufacturer that employs 58% of your population, for example. So it's important to recognize that, the need to access schools. And if there is a larger than average abundance of senior citizens, I guess, they might need access to healthcare more than the average population would. And Quinte Access in Prince Edward County actually focuses on transporting disabled people and senior citizens. So I think, does that answer your question?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, we want to thank our panel. We have a small thank you gift as a parting gift, I guess, and as you take your seats. And we're going to invite our next panel up. Let's just thank our panel before we do that.